So, good evening, everyone, and welcome to this truly inspiring evening on the first day of Black History Month. My name is Sally Bachman. I have the great fortune of serving as the Dean of the School of Social Policy and Practice. Thank you. And we are here to celebrate Ben Jealous' new book, Never Forget, Our People Were Always Free, A Parable of American Healing. Ben is a distinguished visiting fellow at the Penn Carey Law School and professor of the practice at our school, the School of Social Policy and Practice, and the Annenberg School for Communication. He's also the newly appointed executive director of the Sierra Club. Congratulations, Ben. The opportunity to meet and work with Ben Jealous has been a deep honor for me. Like his new book, Ben embodies hope, and he helps us to see the path forward. Ben has an unwavering commitment to social change, racial justice, social justice, and he inspires me as I work to advance the mission of the School of Social Policy and Practice. When Ben was selected to head the NAACP at the age of 35, he became the organization's youngest ever national leader. His family's strong community activism dates back generations, and his SP2 connection traces back many decades to his late beloved grandmother, who figures into Ben's story and was an SP2 alumna that I had the great privilege of corresponding with before she passed away. I'm grateful that Ben will be interviewed by Dr. Camille Z. Charles, who is the Walter H. and Lenore C. Annenberg Professor in the Social Sciences, Professor of Sociology and Africana Studies Department Chair, Interim Director of the Center for Africana Studies, and Faculty Co-Director of the Office of Penn First Plus. Dr. Charles' research centers around racial inequality in the United States. Her publications include her recent new book, Young, Gifted, and Diverse, Origins of the New Black Elite, an examination of the diverse origins and experiences of Blacks at elite colleges and universities. I know that you are as eager as I am to hear this timely and important conversation guided by Dr. Charles about the parables Ben provides us. They point us toward healing and reconciliation during a time of great polarization. We need to hear this discussion. So thank you, Ben. Thank you, Camille.
Thank you, Tim.
Thank you for this, and thank you all for being here. Ben and I were talking about how I'm a pessimist. He's an optimist. So the last line in the book was really resonated for me. That his grandmother told him that that pessimists are right more, but that optimists win more. And one of the things that I wanted to ask you to talk about is remaining optimistic as we watch our politics and our sort of social attitudes and beliefs become increasingly polarized, and how you can maintain that optimism, but also how would you talk about that to younger people today who have never experienced a two-party system that functions more normally.
Yes. So we say down south, it functions more better. First of all, thank you, Dr. Charles, for doing this with me tonight, and creating space for me in the Africana Studies Department. I want to thank Dean Bachman for all of her support. For friends who turned out tonight, some students who were required to be here. My cousin Piper Kendrick's here, who leads the Africana Studies Department at the College of New Jersey. And I look at her, and she reminds me my grandfather's side of the family, who were free way back. They say some of them descend from some of us, in our family tree descended from white women in the 1600s who had children with enslaved African men, and the children were born free. And that side of the family is rebellious too, in a beautiful way, and help start Liberia. But this very much, as Dean Bachman and Professor Charles, Chair of Africana Studies, has zeroed in on, centers around my grandmother and her sense of optimism. And she was a woman who commuted from the tenements of West Baltimore to Penn on a scholarship provided by the state of Maryland, because the University of Maryland had been systematically discriminating against black graduate students. And while Maryland did not bar blacks from entry by law like Virginia did, this is in the era of separate but equal pre-Brown, they did just simply not admit black students. And so Thurgood Marshall, and one of the precursors to Brown, the major one, sued the University of Maryland system and won a judgment that said that Maryland would pay for black graduate students to attend school out of state. And that's how the state of Maryland paid for my grandma to go to Penn. And I think their hope, honestly, was that those graduate students would stay gone, but my grandma came right back home to Baltimore and set up Child Protective Services in that city with a campaign against gentlemen's clubs that were sexually exploiting tweens in Baltimore. She was a force of nature, and Penn helped accelerate that. And I just want to recognize her at the beginning, because Penn, all Ivy League schools are kind of contested space, and there's always kind of tensions around race. And yet I grew up in a summer community in which there were multiple black women who went to Penn before Brown. And I just think we should just also own that that's something that's perhaps more normal here longer than it is in other Ivy League institutions. I've also taught at Princeton. That would not be the case at Princeton, for instance. I'm also joined by my co-teacher, Dr. Schwartz, tonight. It's good to see Ariel. I'm going to read something in a second, but to talk about that sense of optimism. My grandmother had inherited a lot of pain. Her, as one writer once observed, you could describe her body as a Confederate monument. As a reveal in the book, we're cousins to Robert E. Lee. We descend from Thomas Jefferson's grandma. And in the title of the book was this riddle that, as you find when you dig into the book, we solve, and it is literally the echo of a battle cry from the first woman in that maternal line to have to raise children in slavery in the United States. And that's what she would tell her children. And it was repeated down our maternal line, really without question, long after we forgot where we came from, long after what we could possibly remember when it made sense or how it made sense. But with a combination of DNA and historians and some psychologists, were able to get, I think, a pretty good sense of what this meant, where it came from, and why Grandma kept repeating it. I thought I would start tonight, and I am optimistic ultimately because I choose to look at history in centuries and not in days or years or decades. If you're feeling anxious in our politics, number one best thing you can do is turn off 24-hour news. I talk on 24-hour news, but I don't watch it. And my grandmother pointed out something a long time ago that stuck with me. I remember Quayle, Washington, went to graduate school at Oxford's here tonight. I would talk about this when we were at grad school. That we've had a New South before. Like my good friend Stacey Abrams, who shows up in the books, working to create a New South right now. Right? Reverend Barber down there is working to create a New South right now. You could, fair question, like why would we believe in the possibility of a New South again? Who wants to be a 3-time loser? We've already failed in that experiment at least twice. The first time was Reconstruction. It ended badly. Go into some of that in the book. Second time was the second Reconstruction. Ended with Reagan, kind of badly. And Jerry Falwell and all that. And so why try again? Well, each of those times it was based on numbers that didn't work. The first New South was only possible because we disenfranchised the old Confederates. Well, when they would get reenfranchised, it would fall apart. The second New South was only possible because Democrats who belonged to the Klan kept voting for Democrats even though the party had moved beyond them. They were still voting straight Democratic tickets. Well, that would end at some point. It would fall apart. But this time it's actually based on numbers and while Democrats aren't completely destiny, these numbers only get better for Democrats forever. And this country will be majority people of color before we get to 2050. And states are becoming majority of people of color. Every year, different states come online. And what Stacey and I figured out 10 years ago was that Georgia already had the voters it needed to pull off victories like we saw with Biden and with Ossoff and with Warnock. And so part of my optimism is actually based on just the numbers lead us towards a place where we're all going to have to figure out how to get along with at least one other group, if not two or three, if we're going to prosper democratically. But optimism is also something that I watched my grandmother practice to great effect. She soldiered in the civil rights movement in Baltimore. She was a leader in the war on poverty in Maryland. She was maybe the first, certainly one of the first black women executives in Maryland state government. She trained a young white social worker along the way named Barbara Mikulski, who would go on to be a U.S. senator. She lived a pretty epic life. She died at 105 last summer. One of the things, though, that she really, when was dealing with racism, with that feeling as a kid, the first time it just kicks you upside the head as a black kid, she did something different that I didn't see other black grandmothers and mothers do. She would look at me and she'd say, "Baby, just feel sorry for him." I mean, think about it for a second. What must it be like to have to live just walking around hating people all day? Oh, baby, for some people, just having to be themselves is punishment enough. And that kind of blew me away because my first response to having to deal with a racist in this little town I grew up was to jump him when he was on roller skates. And my grandmother said, "So you could have walked away from the fight?" It's like, "I started it and I won it." And she was like, "Yeah, let me never hear you say that again." And her response was actually much healthier. But it started sort of a line of inquiry in me about what was going on the other side of that hate equation. That, like my grandmother said, might be reason to feel sorry for somebody. That might ultimately generate empathy. That might generate hope that we could actually come together. And when you're in the South and the intimacy of the South, one of the things that you really see is like, the emperor has no clothes. Like, we're all dealing with the same struggle. And so I want to read you the conclusion of a chapter titled An American Parable. It starts with two Klansmen, two children of Klansmen, talking about the trauma that their father's behavior caused them. When you listen to the child of a Klansman tell you their private story about how the lynchings impacted them, let alone their father, one of the fathers has a nervous breakdown and leads his family into the civil rights movement. Dr. King's wisdom that our destinies are all connected becomes undeniable. There is no way for you to oppress me and mine without you hurting you and yours. But that's only the half of it. As I said, racism is a lie based on a lie. However, there's another lie. That lie is that racism doesn't hurt white people directly. We have already discussed some of the ways racism against blacks has hurt white people as individuals, like this man being part of the lynching and losing his mind because he was also a Christian preacher and the teachings of the Klan and Jesus, the dissonance drove him crazy. The truth is that racism hurts millions upon millions of white people en masse. How so exactly? Racism so colors our nation's collective imagination that it renders entire classes of suffering white people virtually invisible. The narratives about Jim Crow barely mention that the era's state-based voter suppression laws also disenfranchised half the white voters in states like Virginia. And these were white men who didn't own property, who had only had the right to vote for half a century, who suddenly lost it again because they couldn't pay the poll tax. During the height of the war on drugs in the late 1980s and early 1990s, television news convinced the nation that the biggest group of crack addicts was low-income black people. It was actually middle-income white people. The news today rarely shows you a photo of a white person in poverty, despite the fact that there are almost twice as many whites in poverty as blacks. Ask almost any American what group is dying most frequently from bullets and how, and they will answer young black men from homicide. The answer is actually old white men from suicide. Not just higher number, higher rate. When I mentioned those suicide rates to a white friend who hosts a podcast, he opened up about 6 male friends and family members who had killed themselves, including his dad. He had never spoken about these dead loved ones on air before. Why not? It's not news. It's time we start talking about the universality of poverty, addiction, and handgun deaths in American communities. The failure to recognize that large-scale suffering in the failure to recognize that large-scale suffering in white communities can ultimately leave people feeling so isolated they don't realize what's happening to them is part of a much bigger trend. When those trends are exposed for everyone to see in full view, big changes can happen suddenly. The visibility of white poverty during the Great Depression helped fuel national sentiment to create public jobs programs that employed large numbers of Americans of every color. Most recently, the decision by some sheriffs to start showing the pictures of young white people dying from opiate overdoses helped shift the public conversation about heroin being a crime that needed to be punished to an addiction that needed to be treated. It also made it easier to get the millions of American families who had been suffering silently in the shadows to demand policy solutions that would help their addicted loved ones live better lives. In short, the legacy of race and racism has led our nation to equate poverty, addiction, and handgun deaths with black people. In the process, we have ignored even larger numbers of suffering white people and rendered uniting every one of these impacted communities all but impossible. The path to building a better, stronger America starts with being transparent about how many of us of all colors are struggling in similar ways. I mean, think about it. Bill Clinton ended welfare as we know it. He found like the darkest, heaviest black woman he could find to stand right next to him. Today, there are 16 million and change white people in poverty. There are 8 million and change black people in poverty. The biggest group of women who are benefiting from that were always white women. And the rage that we're dealing with, this is part of what gives me optimism, Camille, is the rage that we're dealing with in a lot of places is because of multi-generational poverty in the white community in a sense that it won't ever end. And so, yeah, somebody like Trump comes along. But in the movement, I think what people forget is what Dr. King was trying to teach us at the end. That racism is all we cannot afford to forget why racism as we know it was useful to a king. Right? The word race, talk about, had been basically a word for tribe for 600 years until the early 1700s. It shows up in the Italian language as raza. And then suddenly it shifts to the pseudoscientific hierarchy of multiple human races, which is some crazy notion, all right? There are multiple human races. People like me are called mulattoes because we're likened to mules. Well, mules can't have children because they're a product of two different species, a horse and a donkey. I got 2 kids. Like, that's not what's going on over here.
Me too.
You too, yeah? Exactly. Look at this. A couple mules up here. Childbearing mules, woo! And so they started this thing. And so the idea was that, the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant was the superhuman. Irish somewhere below that. Jews down there. South Asians down there. Asian folks down there. And then there's a subhuman. Caliban, if you will, the Negro. And literally the slave rolls should tell the difference. The slave rolls of the 1600s are like the slave rollers of millennia before. They are people of nations collected in different places. The slave rollers of the 1700s, we are listed like animals. We are listed like animals. And and so what Dr. King was trying to get us to understand was there was a reason why for the King of England, for the colonial government, it was so useful to shift this definition, to embrace it, to popularize it. Just like wealthy whites in Baltimore would popularize the term poor white trash. It started amongst black house servants being dismissive of whites who were struggling, but was popularized by rich whites in the culture. Because they had to drive a wedge between the two groups. What had happened in the 1600s was that European indentured servants and enslaved Africans kept rebelling together. They tried a military response to stop it. It didn't quite stop it. They tried creating new laws to stop it. Didn't quite stop it. And then they embraced the cudgel that is culture. And it worked better. Not perfectly, but it worked better. And you have to say, well, why? Why would that be valuable to a king? Why? Because colonial systems run on divide and conquer. You have a large group of people who, if they rebel, can upset the whole apple cart. You need to divide them. And the numbers in the late 1600s and early 1700s of enslaved Africans and indentured Europeans were so large that if those two groups kept coming together, it could just kill the entire colonial enterprise. So you got to split them and divide them against each other. Well, if you accept that, then it follows that everybody who is divided is hurt because they aren't able to get a big enough group to assert the demand for them to have a better life. And so that's the way that my grandmother taught me to understand racism. And that's why I'm ultimately so optimistic, because I don't think you can actually keep those two groups apart forever. And we finally come together across old lines of divisions. And I show examples of this in the book. I think great things are actually possible. No, we've tried a New America and a New South twice, and it failed because the numbers were wrong. But the numbers now are trending in the right direction, and we've got to keep the faith long enough to actually make the promise of this country real.
Okay. So the sociologist in me
Please.
here's remnants of William Julius Wilson's universal policy solutions for the truly disadvantaged. And I think on the face of it, right, it makes a lot of sense, but we have not been able to translate that into anything meaningful. And in fact, that was sort of his Achilles heel, right? Was that he lays out this great argument. He gives what was labeled a weak policy response. So how would you respond to that in light of, your own, which, and again, it makes complete sense, right? I understand the whole divide and conquer piece of it. And yet, poor whites, working class whites, increasingly middle class disaffected whites, right, are shifting shifting right. Whether or not, right, because racism has become so much a part of our national DNA that we don't have to reinforce the messages that Black people are poor, Black people are lazy, Black people are drug addicted, Black people shoot each other, right? And so they still they still buy into the idea that maybe one day, it's not maybe one day I'll own slaves, right? It's maybe one day I'll have enough money that I'll want that tax cut too.
Right.
So how do you push this particular way of being into the mainstream so that a universal policy response actually gains traction?
So I think there's really three things. One, is what John Powell teaches us about the power of images. So in that reading, I kind of referenced something that was discussed earlier in the book in greater detail. City like Baltimore, for a better part of a century, there has been a public concern about heroin. The face of it has been black and poor black folks. I, on the other hand, work in the financial district in Baltimore when I was an investor, and I had mornings I'd go in and there would literally be a black homeless guy nodding off from heroin and a white trader on a bench who'd been using heroin as a performance-enhancing drug, nodding off like on the same block at the same time. It's a much bigger issue. But still, it was being talked about as, in the most dour and depressing ways, as like, this is a criminal scourge, lock these people up. And then these sheriffs, who essentially were repeatedly burying people that they'd gone to high school with. And in the Mid-South and the Midwest, this felt like something new because NAFTA shifted the distribution of heroin. Heroin was like cocaine back in like the Miami Vice days, was coming across, like it was coming to ports on water. But when you open up the trek lines for NAFTA, and then people who had been growing corn historically in Mexico started growing poppies, because the U.S. dumped all this low-cost corn on Mexico, suddenly coming right up the truck routes was like black tar heroin right into the middle of the country. And at the same time, you had the opiate painkiller issue at the same time. So all of that was converging. And then NAFTA gutted America's 63,000 factories. And study after study shows when the factories disappear, opiate use goes up. So all of that was happening at once, like a perfect storm. In the middle of the country, the sheriffs kept burying people, and they didn't look like the stereotypes. They did look like the face of the actual problem. And so they simply started to take photos of the corpses and put them in the newspaper. And a lot of these places were very white places, and the corpses looked like the town. There was a lot of white kids. And that's what shifted it. Literally, just showing the full face of the problem shifted it. And I think we have to own how powerful media is in our public debate. And one thing we can do is really insist that media actually show in a representative way the class of people that we're talking about. If you're talking about crack addiction, there are stats on who uses cracks in America. Make sure your images reflect that. If you're talking about poverty, there are stats. Make sure they reflect the fact that there are twice as many, almost, whites in poverty as blacks, for instance. That's one thing we can do. The second thing is that we don't actually teach the full history of our country. If I say picture the Boston Massacre, good chance you're going to come up with an image pretty similar to Paul Revere's etching of the Boston Massacre, which was a bunch of white people getting mowed down by a bunch of white people. Go read John Adams' defense. Yeah, the man who would be President Adams was actually the defense lawyer for the British Redcoats who shot those young Americans that day. And in his defense to the court, he describes the crowd. And how does he describe it? Negroes, mulattoes, and jack tars. Now, jack tar is a term for the poorest whites in the U.S. Navy. But before that, there's two descriptors basically for black folks. That's not the image nobody thinks of the Boston Massacre of looking something like a Black Panther rally. But that's basically what he describes. And why is that important? Because there's a whole history of, at the bottom of the economy, blacks and whites coming together that we're not taught. And it only seems to accelerate throughout American history. The surprise in this book for me, even bigger than figuring out that Robert E. Lee was my cousin, which I stopped writing for like a week. I was just totally messed up in the head. For a week, was that my grandmother, her hero was her grandfather, and she had told me he was a black Reconstruction statesman. But the years didn't work out. He was a statesman in Virginia, but after the end of Reconstruction. Like 4 or 5 years after the Hayes-Tilden Compromise of 1876, the end of Reconstruction. And then as I dug into it, what I realized was that he was one of the principal builders of a third party called the Readjusters in Virginia. The founder of that was a former Confederate general. The party had started as a white populist response to the Democrats saying that they were going to kill the free public schools in Virginia that had been started by the black-led Reconstruction governments. Hayes-Tilden Compromise of 1876 had reenfranchised the old Confederates. Things were starting to realign. This first experiment of New South was ending. And the old plantation owning elite said, we can't afford the Civil War debt and these public schools, so we're going to shut down the public schools. Working class whites apparently figured out that was a lot of fancy talk for the fact that they didn't want the schools in the first place because they didn't want them educated either. And so working class white men fled the Democratic Party, started a new party. And General Mahone came over to join them because he owned a Southern Railroad. And while other railroad owners were suppressing populist rebellions in that period, late 1870s, early 1880s, he reasoned that the Southern ones needed a mass movement to get the political power to get money out of Washington into their railroads. So he decided to join his workers rather than suppress his workers. And my grandmother's grandfather had to know that General Mahone was seen by his constituents, by blacks in Southern Virginia, as a war criminal. He had massacred an entire black regiment that surrendered at the end of the Battle of the Crater. But my grandmother's grandfather had also been fighting the Ku Klux Klan for 5 years. And there were real people dying. In the re-election campaign, there'd be 6 people that would die, who would be assassinated. So, when you're at war with the Ku Klux Klan and there's a war criminal who shares your political objectives, maybe you should talk to him. So he goes over to talk to him, and they agree that my grandmother's grandfather will lead blacks into the Readjuster Party because they're both on fire to save the free public schools, which is the number one demand of both their constituents. And they end up with a majority black party led by a former Confederate general and a freeman. They take over the state of Virginia, the governorship, both U.S. senatorships, both houses. They save the free public schools. They abolish the poll tax, which threatened both groups. They radically expanded Virginia Tech to make it the working person's answer to the patrician University of Virginia. And they created Virginia State, the first public HBCU south of the Mason-Dixon. They also abolished the public whipping post that was still being used exclusively to torture. Well, imagine what your imagination of politics might have been if they taught you when you were a kid, after the Civil War, there was this period where Johnny Reb and the Freemen got together and created their own political party that was pro-public education, pro-civil rights, pro-workers' rights. It would lead you to thought that the architects of Jim Crow sure didn't want you to think, and that honestly most corporate capitalists wouldn't want you to think about either. And then you stop for a second, Camila, and you look back and you're like, wait, they didn't assassinate King when he was leading a desegregation battle. They assassinated him when he was trying to unite poor whites and poor blacks. And of all the Black Panther leaders who were assassinated, the one who was most thoroughly assassinated was Fred Hampton. And what was he trying to do? Unite the young patriots who are poor whites and the Black Panther Party who are poor blacks. And then you're like, wait a second, even before Medgar Evers, the most ruthless assassination before Brown of an NAACP leader was Harry Moore and Harriet Moore. They were like the Medgar Evers and Murray Evers of Florida, but this was 1951. And they were blown up so thoroughly on Christmas night. Their daughters are still deeply impacted and in their 90s. I've met their daughters. But they couldn't even find a tooth or toenail. The Klan packed the crawl space under their bedroom so thoroughly with dynamite that when they blew them up, they just went into the atmosphere. We teach that Harry Moore was the leader of the NAACP in Florida, who 15 years before the Voting Rights Act, when there still was a poll tax, got 1 million blacks to pay the poll tax and register to vote. A massive voter registration drive that would not be replicated until 2018. What they don't really focus on, he was also the president of the Florida Progressive Party, which was a multiracial populist party trying to unite blacks and poor whites. And then you go back and there's all these, of course, to FDR, and that was kind of his whole thing. And then you go back before that, and there was black and white sharecroppers who were organizing in the early 1900s. And then you start to realize, wait a second, there's a continuous struggle. And that's part of what makes me optimistic. I saw it in the Bernie Sanders campaign as I talk about in the book, and I've seen it in my own county. I ran for governor of Maryland. Part of what makes me optimistic is this: I live in Trump territory in Maryland, and I have experiences like this at the grocery store. I'll be at the grocery store, and a white guy with prison tattoos will walk up to me, and he'll be scowling because he always scowls. But he'll walk up to me scowling. He'll go, "You're Ben Jealous." This happened to me twice in the last 4 years. And I say, "Yes." And I literally put one foot back like I'm getting ready to fight. and then he'll say, "You better vote. You better run again because I voted for you and I don't usually vote. And like, we need that stuff you were talking about, like healthcare." And so, yeah, like I think that we can actually do this, or they wouldn't have spent so much energy trying to stop it from happening.
Okay, that's fair. So I think I want to make sure that there's time for questions because there are a lot of you, and I'm guessing that there are a lot of questions. The one other thing, though, that I wanted to talk about or get you to talk about that sort of pulled at me was that in much the way that there is that thread of history that we don't know about, I think there is also the way that we're taught about the civil rights struggle that makes it seem like it happened in 15 minutes.
Yes.
Right? And so I think part of the challenge with young people now that some of us older faculty notice, right, is that they get hyped about something and they get out there and then, nothing happens quickly and it gets cold and then, they go inside.
Yeah.
Right? Because there's this sense that, or at least what I get out of it, being somebody who was a toddler in 68, is that certain parents started as particularly middle class Black parents. I think there was a tendency to want to protect them from the horrors that were, right? And so between that and the way that American history is taught, there's just this sense that if we just go out and get loud for a few hours or a few days, maybe a few weeks, right, that something is going to happen. And so then you see the frustration around the lack of progress, whether it's gun rights and sort of safe gun ownership, or it's extrajudicial police violence, that things aren't happening and that we're just sort of living through Groundhog Day over and over again. Right. So how do you prepare young people in that environment to understand that this took decades, right? And it wasn't something that was seasonal. It wasn't something that was safe. And so that there are sacrifices not only around sort of life and liberty, but also just around time, right? And where you place your priorities. Because it seems to me that that's an area where we struggle. And so then we are caught flat-footed when we need to register voters and make sure people get out to vote, or when the legislature, makes it harder for us to vote, when we just feel like we just made it easier for us to vote. So what would you say?
So there's two ways to do it, I would say, that work that I've witnessed. One is Stacey Abrams' approach. We've organized together since we were 19 years old. Somewhere there's a photo of us on the internet. She looks like Stacey Abrams. I in that moment looked like the love child of Ice-T and Chuck D. But she looks like Stacey Abrams. And we've each kind of gone about doing what you describe in different ways. And I'll tell you the two ways. Stacey's way is quite systematic. Somebody said to me, "Oh, you think she's like the second coming of Barack Obama?" I was like, "No, Stacey's actually more impressive." And they're like, "Well, how so?" I said, "Well, let me tell you what Obama didn't do. Obama didn't say, well, 10 years from now, I'm going to run for president. So this year, I'm going to focus on a 10-year campaign to transform the American electorate to make that easier." Like, Barack Obama didn't do that. Stacey Abrams did that down in Georgia. I wrote a report for her a few years into that to validate the numbers in her strategy. It's still on the Center for American Progress website. It's called True South. And she literally set up a school to train young people to be organizers. She then got them to really understand not just how to do voter registration, but quite frankly, what we had been taught by the first generation to build black electoral power after the Voting Rights Act, which is that before you run, you should transform the electorate. And when people had done that in the 60s, and they did that in the 70s, but they didn't do it anymore. And Trace and Stacey trained a very multiracial group of folks to understand that black electoral power was growing in Georgia, Latino electoral power was growing, Asian American electoral power was growing, and a bunch of young people were moving into the state, white and every other color, and that together they could create a new Georgia. And she has trained legions of those people, and that's part of why she's been so resilient as a movement and been able to at least pull off a miracle 3 times, unfortunately not 4. My approach is suitable if somebody has a shorter attention span than Stacey Abrams does. I've never claimed to have her attention span, which is to just study historically how we built movements in this country and sustained them, and then try to replicate that. So the NAACP that I took over was one that the board would say, like why should we focus on investing on like one terrible case when we could prevent 1 million by passing legislation? So it's very much like, go advocate, and we pass laws, and we hold press conferences. And I said, well, because we haven't grown in 20 years. And what made this organization a rocket ship was that we used to champion the cases of individuals who had been gravely injured by the justice system. So if we go back to doing that, I bet that we'll grow again and we'll have more power to win our legislative victories. And that's what we did. I was there for 5.5 years. We took on the Troy Davis case down in Georgia. In 2011, we made that the most tweeted thing, unless you think that Twitter activism has no impact. We made that the most tweeted thing in 2011 after Beyonce is pregnant, was the hashtag Too Much Doubt. And when Gallup was trying to explain to the American people while public support for the death penalty had suddenly plummeted, that was one of 3 reasons. So young people's Twitter activism is worth something. It helped us abolish the death penalty in 2 states the next year. We championed, obviously, so at the end of my tenure, the Trayvon Martin, George Zimmerman case. And in between that, the Scott sisters and John McNeil and Ms. Alexander in Florida, a bunch of cases. But for the young people, the NAACP, every year, there was some new horrible case somewhere, and you were organizing everybody against it. And my last day, really being on duty for the NAACP, was literally the day after George Zimmerman was acquitted. It was the day Black Lives Matter was founded, and I was watching CNN, and I looked on TV, protest after protest after protest, and our convention had just ended, and the kids had flown out Sunday morning, and this is Sunday night, and the kids I was just with were in all these protests all across the country, because we had raised them on a diet of fighting for individuals. It had led them into the advocacy and being very good advocates, and they would help us abolish the death penalty and pass marriage equality and pass the DREAM Act in Maryland. They became real civil rights activists, but it was because we, frankly, opened up the old portal. The doorway to great causes is terrible cases. And the NAACP had shut that door for decades. It had begun to shrink as an organization. After 5 years when I left, we had gone from 16,000 individual donors to the NAACP, which is pretty much almost dead for a group that's 100 years old, to 128,000 donors in 5 years. We'd gone from 175,000 activists email to 1.4 million. We had gone from 5,000 activists on a texting list, on a mobile phone list, to 430,000. And so, and we had gone from, frankly, not winning a lot to winning all the time. We abolished the death penalty in 6 states in 5 years when I was there. And a lot of other victories. Shrank the Georgia prison system and the Texas prison system. Texas had never shut down a prison ever. They only opened up new ones and refurbished old ones, and they've now shut down 12 because of the laws that we passed. So yeah, I think that you've got to, there's kind of like a call and a response in the movement. And the response is ultimately like legislation and changing law, but the call is the terrible cases, and you got to have both of them.
Great, thank you. So somebody here has a microphone for questions? Okay. Nobody has a question? Okay, I thought so.
How you doing?
Good, sir.
Yeah.
Okay, it's on. Okay. You mentioned Dr. King's multiracial Poor People's Campaign.
Yeah.
You mentioned the Black Panther Party and their Rainbow Coalition. What is your assessment of Jesse Jackson co-opting the term Rainbow Coalition in his runs for president? And how do you assess the Democratic Party's reaction? Because it seems that the Democratic Party had a chance to go in a particular direction, but they focus more on trying to get the Reagan Democrats back.
Yeah.
So,
There's a lot there. I think that Reverend Jackson did what leaders often do, which is to, after losing so many friends, to trying to transform the system, just figure out how to work within it. And what he did transformed American politics. It broke, Reagan and Bush at that point had been in office for 12 years when Clinton won. And Clinton could not have won without Jesse's coalition, like 100%. But he also, if you just look at what happened in 1989, Doug Wilder, 88 is the end of the second Jackson campaign and the last campaign for president. 89, David Dinkins, first black mayor of New York, Harold Washington, first black mayor of Chicago, Doug Wilder, first black governor of Virginia, all of them lieutenants from the Jesse Jackson campaign. And Stacey Abrams, Andrew Gillum, and I, also kind of got started as kid activists on that campaign. And we would, in 2018, be only black folks running for governor south of the Mason-Dixon. So there's a real legacy there. Jesse is a survivor. Sometimes we resent the ones who survive. You know who else was a survivor? Thurgood Marshall, who cooperated with the FBI against alleged communists in the NAACP. And yet, I'd hate to imagine America without Thurgood Marshall, at the same time, even recognizing those betrayals of individuals. Today's Democratic Party, the problem for working people in America today is that Donald Trump literally is the incarnation of the sermon that Klansman talked about, who went crazy and regained his sanity by joining the civil rights movement because he was a Methodist preacher and preaching Jesus and practicing Klan wasn't working for him, drove him crazy. And he would preach a sermon and he would say, any white man who has his hand on the neck of a Negro holding him down in a ditch needs to recognize that he's down in the ditch with him. A rich man walks down the middle of the road and laughs at both men in the ditch, the black one and the white one. Donald Trump is the damn rich man on the road. Like, that's clear. The Republican Party, on the one hand, lies to working, struggling people with conviction and comfort. Donald Trump became president parroting the lines of Bernie Sanders, promising people a better healthcare system. You just go back through the tapes. It's bizarre, right? Even got to the left of the Democratic Party on NAFTA. Like, think about that. I was there at the program committee of the Democratic Party arguing with Hillary Clinton's camp, explaining to them that letting the Republicans get to the left of us on trade is not good. But in the Democratic Party, my uncle, who was a Democrat for a long time, Northern New England, manages, like mid-level manager in a lumber yard, is pretty certain that the Democratic Party forgot men like him existed like 2 generations ago. And the danger is that if you don't have an agenda for working class white men, you don't really have an economic agenda for working class anybody. What you have is an anti-discrimination agenda for other groups that face discrimination. But when it comes down to the kitchen table, like, everybody has the same concern. We got young men who aren't going to graduate college. What do we do with them? We got young women who are, coming out of college. Increasingly, the communities are skewed that way. More women are coming out than men, and they're totally in debt. What are we going to do? And so, like, working people, I think, in this country right now are right to feel betrayed by both parties. The Democratic Party has become captive by corporations, and the Republican Party has been captive to the old, Dixiecrat strategic racism. And neither one of those are a formula for any working people to win. That's just real.
Thank you. There was another question over here.
And a comment really. In Pennsylvania, Ceasefire, Pennsylvania, listed the 3 counties with the highest per capita gun violence levels. The first one is the county we're in, Philadelphia, but the other 2 were poor white rural counties, Fulton County and I believe Wayne County. And it just, poverty strikes everybody, literally and figuratively in this case.
No, it's real, and I'm sure that they weren't including suicide in the violence stats. It's not seen as an act of violence, although killing yourself is pretty damn violent. And when you factor those in, it gets real. It gets real different than what you see on the news real fast.
Are there other questions? Here's one.
Thank you. I had the pleasure of hearing many of these stories that I read many, many times from Professor Jealous, and I really appreciate that. And I'm curious to hear a little behind the scenes on crafting a story for the purpose of mobilizing a lesson that you think is important. I think that's what I read you were trying to do, and I'm curious to know how you tell a story so well, and then also how we can use stories in service of social missions.
I'm very much my grandma's baby, and she was, a Southern storyteller. It's a region where things move more slowly because there's more poverty. Poverty, and economists once observed, is the best form of historic preservation. And I wrote the book in part because my life doesn't allow me the leisure, at least not yet, to just sit and tell my kids the same story over and over. Dr. Schwartz hears them because we teach together every year, so the same stories get told. And I wanted to make sure that they would retain the most important ones, so I figured I better put it into a book. The book for a long time was to have a different title. The title was going to be "We Got What We Fought For, But We Lost What We Had." It was really a book of grievance and of mourning. My cousin Piper Kendricks over there, our families carry with them memory of, black downtowns and commercial districts that were thriving. Right? My mom cries every time she drives through West Baltimore because of the ghosts of what was there before segregation ended. And that was going to be the book, but it sort of felt wrong both to leave that to my kids and to leave that to the country, just a book of grievance. And we have a lot of those. And then January 6th happened, and all of a sudden the book got a breath of fresh air. I live in Trump territory in Maryland. Why? Because I'm a waterman, and the water there is kind of dominated by Republicans. And adjacent to it is a white ghetto. My kids, we go to church in the black ghetto, our church in the poorest neighborhood of all 215 in Baltimore. Families go there for 80 years. We come home, my kids are like, where we live and where we go to church is kind of the same. It's like we buy gold and like gun shops. I'm like, yeah, black ghetto, white ghetto. But in my community, there was a lot of casual talk throughout the late 2020s. We were all walking our dogs. Oh, there's a civil war coming. There's a civil war coming. There's a civil war coming. And then all of a sudden there's a coup. There's a failed coup. And it's pretty violent. I mean, there's a lot of police officers this was something we hadn't seen before. And I realized that if I was going to write a book, I needed to write a book that I could hand to my white uncle who watches Fox and One America Network, which, by the way, I talk on both those now, just trying to talk to him and some other folks who I love, and the rest of the country. And that I could hand to my black niece who, man, she only has one truth, and you better agree with it, or she's just going to just wear you out. And I want to be able to hand a book to either one of them, and then hope we could make better like all of us could have a conversation at the end because he's her great uncle, you know. And so I sat down, and I wrote an arc of 23 chapters, and then I just stared at my computer. I was stuck. I'd had a ghostwriter for 2 years. I had to fire them. It was not working out. And it turns out, if you give a bunch of money to a ghostwriter, the publisher still wants you to finish the damn book. There's no more money. So I just had to write it myself on a pretty tight deadline. And I remember that Frederick Douglass, who's my big hero, had composed his books as extemporaneous speeches. That he would give a series of extemporaneous speeches, and then he would translate. So it was COVID, y'all. I talked to my bobbleheads. I lined up my bobbleheads, and I gave 23 speeches to my bobbleheads. And I did 85, 90% of this book in 2 weeks. And there's still, this one was rushed, this version, the electronic version is very clean. This version was rushed to the press a week earlier than because of some supply chain issues, a week earlier than they had told us. So the final corrections are not in this book. And the book was a little bit like dictating a long text, because I was literally talking, voice recording, and then they were and it turns out people transcribe. It's not much better than a computer. And they definitely put in words you didn't say, and no copyright editor could catch, because they spelled it correctly. It just wasn't what you said. So there's a few of those left. But yeah, that's the look behind the scenes. It was me talking to my computer, trying to get out a message to try to help hold my family together and this country together.
Thank you. Yeah, so I guess you're coming back now. I'm just following directions.
Yeah, we have, I want to say thank you to all the people who've helped us organize tonight. So if you've played a role in that, just wave your hand. You have to wave your hand, those of you who did this.
Thank you.
So I want to allow plenty of time for what's going to follow here, but I want to just say thank you to both of you for this incredibly wonderful discussion. We must have conversations like this with incredible people like this. Ben, as one reviewer said, I read the reviews. Your book is honest, uplifting, and optimistic, which is exactly how I know you. You give us all hope and energy to continue our commitment to social justice, and we all thank you for that. I want to thank you all for joining us today. I look forward to seeing you back in the back where we have a reception, and I also want you to know that in I guess it's next month, we're going to see Ben sitting where Camille is now when he interviews Nicole Hannah-Jones, March 30th. He'll be back on campus for a conversation, and this is part of a series that we have at the School of Social Policy and Practice called One Book, One SB2. And you'll be able to find registration for this event coming around before too long. So please stay and join us. Ben, I brought him a pen, so I know he's ready to sign copies of his book. I have mine in my bag. You may not have it. And so I just want to close by saying thank you for being here, and thank you so much. So.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, guys.
So I'm not sure. I know that I saw books out back. So is that so? So books are for sale in the back, and then I assume Ben is going to sit here.
I thought it was just the Observer.
So Ben, you're going to stay here to
Yeah,
sign.
yeah,
You
I'll
think
stay here to
so?
sign.
That's the plan. So thank you, everyone.
Just cracked me up.
Yeah, right.
Because Scott was working at the Observer when we met
Oh, really?
in '94.
Yeah.
And he went,
Was the Observer Jerry Mondesire's paper? Or whose-
no, it's Bill Lee's, it's Larry's.
Oh, the Observer in Sacramento.
Yeah,
Yes.
sorry.
But he's greatly improved it.
No,
Larry
he
has, yes.
He has,
But
absolutely.
back in the day, no, that was
It's
true.
like profitable now.
Yes, it is.
But I mean, we used to joke because you couldn't.
Sorry, Dean.
We couldn't find